What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through how I am weaponizing curiosity like a systems architect. Like always with these videos, the main mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that we're actively implementing in terms of mental models and frameworks, also just to learn from them, and also just to come in and to solve where it hurts. So basically just to be the chief problem solvers and ultimately build backend infrastructure while we're doing it. And also just to call in visionaries, basically people that are aligned with what it is that we're actively doing in terms of solving for chaos, and also just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So here's how I am thinking about curiosity now and how it is shaping Killer Chaos OS. So number one is asking why until it hurts, basically just having that level of saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're asking why until it hurts, basically getting to the root cause of it, using first principles to say, hey, this functions like this. Yes, we understand it at its surface, but let's dig a lot deeper. And how do we dig a lot deeper? We simply just ask why until it hurts, until we understand the root cause of what it is that we're actively doing, and saying, hey, when something breaks, I don't patch, I basically interrogate. I ask why is this system not working? Why is our client acquisition strategies not yielding the results that we need to? Okay, let's say, hey, it's the messaging that's not working. Okay, what about the messaging is not working? Is it that we're not getting the right positioning as well, or we're just making spelling mistakes? Like, what is going on? And then ultimately just testing that and saying, hey, I'm going to interrogate and ask why until it hurts, because ultimately getting to the root cause of it is ultimately then going to allow us to understand every single aspect, which will then allow us to tweak where we need to. Because if you understand the entire machine, then you ultimately understand where you can fix it rather than not knowing where to go in terms of asking those questions. And I think those questions ultimately give you that level of awareness that you wouldn't have had if you didn't interrogate deep. And I think interrogating deeper than ever before is ultimately what pushes me to say, hey, I need to make sure that I'm constantly asking why until it hurts and getting to the root cause of it. When I was younger, I never used to think asking questions was super important, up until now that I realized, and I've gotten a bit older, then I just realized that, hey, asking why is ultimately giving us a new level or helping us get closer to the source of truth. And if that why ultimately yields the breakthrough that we need to get to the source of truth, then why not keep asking until we get there? And saying, hey, a dashboard was lagging for a planner. We basically said, hey, we could have increased the sync frequency, or then and then I basically asked, hey, why 5 times, ultimately asking why is this frequency, what is actually going on, and how can we actively solve this? Why is this reacting in the way that it is? And saying, hey, the recursive data call looping through an outdated logic. So basically using outdated logic specifically for this sequence that we were running, and ultimately saying, hey, this dashboard was not working simply because we weren't using updated logic. We were using outdated logic that we were using for this specific function. And then we said, hey, we fixed the API, cleaned up the logic, and then ultimately the speed doubled. Ultimately saying, hey, we asked why, and that ultimately led us to the source of truth of saying, hey, we needed to fix the API, then we needed to clean up the logic because the logic was disconnected, and then ultimately the speed of that dashboard ultimately doubled, which then yielded the results that we needed in that specific point in time. And saying, hey, systems aren't built from answers, they're basically built from asking better questions, and then ultimately just understanding how to ask these questions and asking why and just interrogating ultimately allows us to build these systems. Because ultimately asking questions, I think, is one of the most important things, and asking the right questions as well in terms of building systems. Because once you ask the right questions, you get to the source of truth of what is actually going on within the system or what actually needs to be built, and then you reason up from there. And I think this is why systems thinking and also first principles is super important in terms of building systems, because you ultimately need to understand it from its root to then build a solution while incorporating different aspects, and understanding those different aspects and how they react in the entire system is super important. And this is just my personal take on it, to say, hey, we need to make sure that we actively understand each and every single aspect from the root, and then we reason up from there. But in order to do that, we need to ask better questions that ultimately allow us to reach that source of truth. But in order to do that as well, while, we need to ultimately just ask 5 or more questions of saying, why is this happening in the way that it's doing? Why is the logic structure in the way that it is right now? And how can we better that logic structure so that it ultimately syncs with the dashboard as well? And saying, hey, we also need to hunt outside the bubble, basically saying, hey, stole a hack from a logistics thread about how Amazon batches orders, ultimately saying, hey, we then applied it to a planner's task batching, saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're just getting new nuggets from different aspects and just stealing different hacks, and ultimately understanding these different hacks will ultimately just allow us to then refine our product, because I know that each and everything that we're doing, we can steal different nuggets and incorporate different things from different verticals, and also ultimately just have those within our current stack to say, hey, even though we're working in this specific niche or we're working in this specific industry, we know that there's certain nuggets that are going to come from different industries as well that can ultimately 10x what it is that we're doing right now. And saying, hey, what is the lesson? Curiosity grows from cross-pollination, saying, hey, now I'm studying how air traffic controls work for scalable alerting logic, basically saying, hey, I'm super deep into aerospace and airplanes as well, so ultimately understanding how that works ultimately gives me a new level of understanding in terms of how we're actively just going to rewrite different things within what it is that we're building for Killer Chaos OS, and saying, hey, we're stealing different nuggets from everywhere else and we're hunting outside from our specific bubble, because I know that, hey, we need to be creative, and in order to be creative we can steal different things from different industries, and within those different industries there's always a theme or a consistent thing that happens that also ultimately allows us to then steal from that, or to steal like an artist and then ultimately incorporate in what it is that we're doing, and saying, hey, where else can I steal elegant solutions from? Ultimately asking, how can I steal like as an artist or like an artist from different industries that we can also ultimately incorporate in what it is that we're doing, and also just better our product and better understand what it is that we're doing, because there's always something else in different industries that can always allow you to then 10x what it is that you're doing. You can say, hey, I'm getting nuggets from, say, from the fitness industry. What about the fitness industry is giving us nuggets? It's basically how people react. Just for an example, to say, hey, people come to the gym because they want to feel like they're accomplishing something, so why don't we steal certain different tactics or hacks from that and ultimately just incorporate it into our user experience, and saying, hey, we need to make sure that people are feel like they're accomplishing something, and how do we constantly just have that within our systems and also just refine it as we go, and saying, hey, we need to make sure we also are ultimately testing like a mad scientist, because this is super important to making sure that, hey, we're constantly testing and we're getting data points and running those data points through feedback loops as well, in order to ultimately just build better and also just do better in terms of client acquisition, our strategies that we have, to say, hey, curiosity without testing is fantasy. In as much as you can have curiosity and ask these questions, you ultimately just need to test, and ultimately bringing this test or this curiosity into the real world is ultimately what you need to achieve, or what we need to do on a day-to-day basis, to say, hey, I wanted to know why cold emails replies dropped, so I then tested different subject lines. I asked why is this not working? Why are the email subject lines not getting open, or why are our emails not getting open? And then ultimately giving that, asking those whys and then testing it, ultimately allows us to then increase our open rate by 20%, and then saying, hey, not every question needs a roadmap. We just need to make sure they need a playing ground, and by that playing ground we ultimately need to make sure that, hey, we're actively just building that platform or just testing it, and then making sure that, hey, this assumption or this theory that we have, that we asked why so many times, we ultimately test it and see how it reacts in the real world, and if it does work, then we build better feedback loops in order to improve it, and if it doesn't, then we ultimately just do the same but in a different strategies, just making sure that we're constantly learning each and every single day, and saying, hey, what experiment can I run this week that doesn't need permission? Ultimately saying, hey, what can I do this week that ultimately allows us to better our product and makes sure that we are just getting things done. Because by testing and just doing stuff, I know we'll reach a new level of truth or source of truth that will ultimately allow us to just refine the process of what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, and also scale what we're doing inside Killer Chaos OS. And ultimately just asking questions and also hunting outside our bubble, I believe, is ultimately just going to allow us to keep being lifelong learners in terms of what it is that we're doing. Because once we take different aspects or different nuggets from different places, I know we can come up and be more creative in what it is that we're doing, and also coming up with new solutions as well. And with those solutions, we also need to make sure that we're testing, which is super important, because without testing, you just basically don't know if it's working or not. And that's why it's super important to build strong feedback loops in what it is that we're doing. And I think one of the main things that I have been focusing on a lot on lately is building those strong feedback loops to basically say, hey, how can I better refine our feedback loops and just basically scale them into the future. And saying, hey, number 4, which is super important, which is love the L. And loving the L is one of the most important things, at least I found, to say, hey, we launched a feature, it didn't pop. Instead of just fixing, I then went deep and said, hey, I hopped on the call, and then ultimately said, hey, I saw the disconnect, and then rebuilt it in Figma, ultimately saying, hey, we're gonna lose so many times, and that's okay, but how do we then fall in love with losing or with the L, and ultimately learn and refine from that? Because that's super important. It doesn't matter how many times you lose or how many L's you have, ultimately how can you come back from that is super strong. And I know that into the future of what it is that we're going to be doing, we're going to fail so many times, but ultimately asking the question of, okay, we failed. Now, how can we move forward and just keep pushing the needle forward and just keep hitting the nail in the wall? How can we actively do that on a day-to-day basis? Even though we've lost, we just ultimately just need to ship. And ultimately shipping and building better feedback loops, because like Albert Einstein once said, a fool is someone that does the same thing over and over and expects a different result. So ultimately just making sure that, hey, we may fail and that's okay, but ultimately how can we do something different that ultimately allows us to scale and also fall in love with the L, because that is the most important thing. We're going to fail so many times, and I don't even know or can comprehend at the moment how many times we're going to fail, but I don't focus too much on that. It's just more so how can we bounce back and how can we build better and scale better into the future, and also just rebuild. So saying, hey, each time something fails, how can we then just rebuild it the next day and just have that sense of urgency and just rebuild it and ultimately just get it fixed as soon as possible. And saying, hey, it came down to being one of the most used modules, ultimately saying, hey, we built this backend dashboard feature that ultimately was then incorporated into the business so they could log in and do certain functions, and then ultimately said, hey, it didn't pop off in the beginning because it was a bit too complicated in terms of how it was working and things like that. So then we simplified it, and then ultimately we then just said, hey, we're done. We simplified it, we fixed it, and we've ultimately just went deep on it in order to simplify it, and then there it goes, shipped it straight away. And saying, hey, curiosity turns loss into signal, ultimately asking the question of, hey, how can we actively turn this loss into signal, basically allowing us to scale what it is that we're doing. Because when we can take this and turn it into signal to say, hey, we're just rebuilding and that's okay, that's part of life, that's part of the lessons, we're ultimately just becoming better operators, and we're just becoming better in every single aspect in terms of what it is that we're doing, and we are also actively just learning lessons, which is one of the most important things. And saying, hey, every failure is just an unopened lesson, ultimately saying, hey, we have so many lessons that are unopened, and we're gonna figure it out each and every single time to say, hey, every failure, temporary defeat, if you will, is ultimately an unopened lesson, and there are going to be so many temporary defeats that we're going to face, but ultimately how can we come back stronger from those each and every single time, and how can we build better and scale better into the future will be one of the most important things. And just constantly just asking those questions, I think, will also just allow us to then tie every single thing to the vision, which is one of the most important things, and I like to speak about each and every single time to say, hey, I'm not curious just for the dopamine, machine, I ask every question. Every question I ask why. Every test is tied to the $100 million vision behind Killer Chaos OS. So basically, if you don't know what it is, it's basically to inspire millions of people to reshape industries and also to have $100 million worth of impact in terms of what it is that we're doing, and also mainly just to inspire millions of people, because I think that is super important. That would be a cool story to tell, that hey, Killer Chaos OS, our internal operating system, ultimately inspired millions of people and showed them what's possible, and was one of the things that shaped their lives as well. I think that would be one of the most impactful things that we could possibly do. And then just the $100 million is just a number to equate that. But obviously, ultimately saying, hey, we want to reshape industries, we want to inspire millions of people, and ultimately just change the trajectory of what it is that we're doing by ultimately solving chaos and building cool stuff at the same time. And that ultimately is one thing through that is driven through chaos. I mean, through curiosity, and saying, hey, curiosity isn't chaos, it's a compass. Ultimately, asking why each and every single time ultimately allows us to reach that level of awareness that we wouldn't have had before if we didn't ask why, and ultimately gets us to that source of truth that we can then reason up from there, which I am super bullish on in terms of first principles and systems thinking, and saying, hey, each and every single day we need to be refining the machine, asking why, and also refining what it is that we're doing in terms of our mental models and feedback loops, because we're going to fail so many times, but those temporary defeats are just unopened lessons, and we have to actively learn from those and scale those into the future, which I'm super excited about. And I'm super excited also just to be refining the process, changing things up, testing new things, and also just scaling that into the future and saying, hey, how can we just attack each and every single day, build better, scale better into the future, and also just build cool products that people also enjoy and also serve a meaningful ROI into the future. And I know we're going to get there, but like always, we're still in the trenches. We're going to fail so many times, but those are unopened lessons that we're actively just going to build from and scale better into the future. So I'm super excited. And if you guys enjoy this video and you want to connect with me, make sure to leave a comment on this video, connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.